A racist cop arrests an innocent man, but when their past is revealed, it changes everything. He thought it was just another arrest, until he realized he was handcuffing his childhood best friend. Hello friends, welcome to my channel. Please subscribe my channel for more daily interesting narration. Thank you. Officer Jake Monroe was known around town for his no-nonsense attitude and sharp instincts. A veteran on the force, he had spent over a decade patrolling the same streets, cracking down on crime with an iron fist. But Monroe had a reputation, one whispered among the community but never outright spoken in the precinct. He was tough, sure, but his actions often seemed harsher when dealing with people of color. His colleagues shrugged it off as Monroe just being old school. Jake, however, didn't see himself as a racist. He told himself he was just doing his job. That day was no different. As Jake drove through the west side of town, he noticed an old, beat-up sedan parked outside a corner store. The driver, a black man in his mid-30s, was standing near the vehicle, checking his phone. Something about him struck Jake as off. His instincts flared, or so he convinced himself. In reality, it was the color of the man's skin combined with the rough look of the car that caught his attention. Jake parked his cruiser a block away and radioed in, claiming suspicious behavior. He approached the man cautiously, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "Hey, step away from the car," Jake barked, his voice sharp and commanding. The man, startled, looked up. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his tone calm but cautious. "You tell me. What are you doing out here? This your car?" Jake demanded, eyeing the man up and down. "Yes, it's mine," the man replied, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I just stepped out to check a message. Is there an issue?" Jake's eyes narrowed. "Mind if I take a look inside?" The man hesitated. "Actually, I do mind. You don't have a warrant." Jake's suspicion deepened. In his mind, refusing a search was as good as an admission of guilt. Without waiting for consent, Jake pushed past the man and opened the car door. Inside, he found a small baggie of what appeared to be drugs under the seat. Jake turned to the man, a smirk of triumph on his face. Well, what do we have here? You want to explain this?" The man's expression shifted from confusion to anger. "I don't know what that is, but it's not mine. Save it for the judge," Jake snapped, slapping handcuffs on the man's wrists. As Jake marched him toward the cruiser, the man looked at him closely, something dawning in his eyes. "Jake? Is that you?" Jake froze mid-step. The sound of his name, spoken with familiarity, sent a chill down his spine. He turned to look at the man, really look at him, for the first time. "Do I know you?" Jake asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "It's me, Marcus King. We went to high school together." For a moment, the noise of the city around them faded. Jake stared at Marcus, memories of their shared youth flashing in his mind. They had been inseparable once, best friends, practically brothers. But life had taken them down very different paths. Jake shook his head, his grip tightening on Marcus's arm. "That doesn't change anything," he muttered, shoving Marcus into the back seat of the cruiser. As Jake drove to the station, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The man he had just arrested wasn't just some random suspect. He was Marcus, the kid who used to share his lunch and play basketball with him after school. But Jake buried the thought deep. A job was a job, and Marcus had drugs in his car. That was all that mattered, or so he told himself. At the station, Jake filled out the paperwork while Marcus sat silently in the holding cell. But as Jake handed the report to his superior, a nagging doubt began to creep into his mind. Something about this didn't add up. He knew Marcus. He knew the kind of person he was, or at least the person he used to be. Could he have changed that much? Jake pushed the thought away. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let sentimentality get in the way. But as the hours ticked by, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake. And then, something unexpected happened. One of the lab techs approached Jake with a frown on her face. "Officer Monroe, we've got a problem. The drugs you found in the car, they're not drugs. It's just powdered aspirin." Jake's heart sank. The baggie, the arrest, everything, it had been a mistake. He looked over at Marcus, who sat in the holding cell with a weary expression. For the first time in years, Jake felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The past had come crashing into his present, and with it came a choice. Would he continue to cling to his biases, or would he finally confront the truth about himself? Jake sat at his desk, staring blankly at the lab report. The words blurred in his vision, but the meaning was crystal clear. The evidence that had justified Marcus's arrest wasn't evidence at all. It was nothing. He clenched his jaw, his mind racing. Mistakes like this could cost careers, or worse, lives. He cast a glance at Marcus, who was now pacing inside the holding cell. The same face he had recognized earlier was no longer clouded by suspicion, but instead illuminated by memories. They had been inseparable once. Jake remembered how Marcus had stood up for him against bullies in middle school, how they had dreamed about their futures. Dreams that didn't include the mess they were in now. "Monroe," came the voice of Captain Harris, snapping Jake out of his daze. "You got a minute?" Jake stood abruptly, clutching the report. "Captain, there's a—" Harris waved him into his office, cutting him off. Jake followed, dreading what was to come. Once the door was shut, Harris folded his arms. "Got word that the arrest you made this afternoon isn't sitting right. Lab says the drugs aren't drugs. Care to explain how we've got a man in a cell for possession of powdered aspirin?" Jake swallowed hard. "Captain, the baggie was hidden under the seat. It looked suspicious. I acted based on what I thought was probable cause." "Probable cause?" Harris leaned forward, his tone icy. "Or bias?" Jake flinched. "That's not fair. I didn't know." "You didn't know it was Marcus King?" Harris interrupted. "You didn't recognize your old friend when you cuffed him and dragged him in here? Or was that just an added bonus?" Jake felt his face flush. "I didn't realize it was him until after the arrest." Harris sighed heavily, shaking his head. "You better fix this, Monroe. We can't afford a lawsuit, and frankly, you can't afford another screw-up. Marcus King isn't just some nobody. He's well respected in this community, and you just dragged him in here over aspirin. Get your act together, or I'll make sure you're off the force." Jake left the office feeling a mix of shame and anger. Harris's words stung, but not because they were harsh, because they were true. As he returned to his desk, he saw Marcus sitting in the holding cell, staring at the floor. Something about the scene twisted Jake's stomach. He grabbed the key to the cell and walked over, his footsteps heavy with guilt. "Marcus," he called. Marcus looked up, his eyes tired but sharp. "What now, Officer Monroe? Want to accuse me of something else I didn't do?" Jake winced at the bitterness in Marcus's voice. He unlocked the cell door and stepped aside. "You're free to go. The lab confirmed the baggie wasn't drugs. I made a mistake." Marcus stood slowly, his movements deliberate, as if he didn't quite believe what he was hearing. "A mistake?" he repeated, his voice calm but simmering with anger. "That's what you're calling it?" Jake avoided Marcus's gaze. "I acted on what I thought was reasonable suspicion." Marcus let out a dry laugh. "Reasonable suspicion? Is that what you call pulling over a black man in an old car and deciding he must be a criminal? You didn't see me, Jake. You saw what you wanted to see." Jake felt a pang of guilt but struggled to defend himself. "Look, I said I made a mistake. What more do you want from me?" "I want you to admit that it wasn't just a mistake," Marcus snapped. "You didn't even hesitate to think that maybe I wasn't guilty. You saw me, and you assumed the worst." Jake's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to argue, to push back, but deep down he knew Marcus was right. He had acted on bias, not facts. "I messed up," Jake admitted, his voice low. "I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions." I shouldn't have treated you like that. Marcus stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. Jake, we were friends once. Do you even remember that? Or has this badge erased who you used to be? The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He thought back to the times they'd spent together as kids, the bond they'd shared. Somewhere along the line, he had lost that part of himself, the part that saw people as individuals, not threats. Marcus grabbed his jacket and started toward the door. Before he left, he turned back to Jake. You want to make it right? Stop looking at people like they're guilty until proven innocent. Not just for me, but for everyone. Jake watched him walk out, the door swinging shut behind him. He sat back down at his desk, staring at the empty cell. Marcus's words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront a truth he had been avoiding for years. For the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel like the hero he thought he was. Instead, he felt like a man who had a lot to learn, and even more to make up for. Jake sat at his desk long after Marcus had left, unable to shake the gnawing feeling in his chest. The precinct was quieter now, with only a few officers lingering around, filing reports or making small talk. But for Jake, the room was suffocating. Every corner seemed to echo Marcus's words. You didn't see me, Jake. You saw what you wanted to see. He buried his face in his hands, his mind spiraling into memories of their childhood. They had been more than friends, they were practically brothers. Growing up in a tough neighborhood, they'd leaned on each other for everything. When Jake's dad left, it was Marcus who brought over food when Jake's mom couldn't make ends meet. And when Marcus's mom worked late-night shifts, Jake's family made sure he had a place to sleep. They were inseparable until they weren't. Jake had left the neighborhood after high school to join the academy, distancing himself from the life he wanted to leave behind. Marcus had stayed working odd jobs and, eventually, starting his own small business, a landscaping company Jake vaguely remembered hearing about. It wasn't that Jake had forgotten Marcus. He had just let their paths diverge without a second thought. But now, staring at the empty cell where Marcus had been sitting, Jake realized just how far they had drifted apart. Monroe! A voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Officer Lopez, a younger cop with sharp eyes and a knack for keeping tabs on everyone. You good? You've been sitting here like a statue for an hour. Jake looked up, forcing a weak smile. Yeah, just thinking. Lopez leaned against the desk, her expression skeptical. Is this about the guy you let go earlier? Word's already spreading. People are saying you nearly arrested an old friend over nothing. Jake winced. It wasn't nothing. It was my mistake. Lopez raised an eyebrow. A mistake that could have cost him his freedom or worse. You know the community's watching us closer than ever, right? You think this is just gonna blow over. I know, Jake muttered. I'm trying to figure out how to fix it. Lopez shrugged, pushing off the desk. Fix it, then. But you better do it quick. Once trust is gone, it's hard to get it back. Her words lingered long after she walked away. Jake knew she was right. This wasn't just about Marcus. It was about the trust he had broken, not just with one person, but with an entire community. And fixing it wouldn't be as simple as apologizing. He had to do more. He had to prove he was better. The next day, Jake drove to Marcus's shop. It was a modest storefront with a few landscaping trucks parked out front. Their logos faded but still legible. King's Landscaping Services. The bell above the door jingled as Jake stepped inside, his nerves on edge. He half expected Marcus to kick him out the moment he saw him. Marcus was at the counter talking to a customer. He glanced up when Jake walked in, his expression unreadable. After finishing with the customer, he leaned against the counter, arms crossed. What are you doing here? Jake hesitated, his throat dry. I came to talk, to apologize, properly. Marcus sighed, clearly debating whether to hear him out. After a tense moment, he nodded toward a small table in the corner. Fine. Talk. Jake sat down, his palms sweaty. Marcus, I can't change what happened yesterday, but I can tell you I'm sorry. Not just for arresting you, but for everything. For losing touch. For forgetting what we meant to each other. Marcus didn't say anything, his gaze steady and piercing. Jake continued, his voice earnest. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About how I saw what I wanted to see. You're right. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and that's on me. But I want to make it right. Marcus leaned back, his expression softening slightly. You think an apology is enough, Jake? You think saying sorry fixes the years we lost? Fixes what you did? No, Jake admitted. It doesn't, but it's a start. And I'm not just here to apologize. I'm here to listen, to understand what I can do to make this right. Not just for you, but for everyone I've let down. Marcus studied him for a long moment before speaking. You want to make it right? Start by looking at the system you're a part of. Start by questioning the way you've been trained to see people like me. Because this isn't just about us, Jake. It's bigger than that. Jake nodded, his resolve strengthening. I will. Promise. But Marcus, I need your help. I don't know where to start, and I don't want to mess this up. Marcus's lips twitched into a faint smile, though his eyes remained serious. You want to do better? Then don't just talk about it. Be about it. Come to the community meetings. Hear what people have to say. And don't just listen, act. Jake extended his hand, his voice firm. I'm in. Whatever it takes. Marcus hesitated before shaking Jake's hand, his grip strong. All right, Jake, but this is your second chance. Don't waste it. As Jake left the shop, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. Not just as a cop, but as a person. He had a long way to go, but he was ready to take the first step. The following weeks became a whirlwind of change for Jake. He dove headfirst into rebuilding the bridge he had so carelessly burned, not just with Marcus, but with the entire community he had sworn to protect. Each step was more challenging than the last, but the guilt and determination driving him made him push harder. Jake started with the local community meetings, as Marcus had suggested. The first one was held in the basement of a small church, the air thick with tension when Jake arrived in uniform. Conversations hushed as he walked in, and every pair of eyes in the room turned toward him, their expressions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. Marcus stood near the front, arms crossed as he watched Jake make his way to an empty chair. Jake felt the weight of judgment pressing down on him, but he didn't falter. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. When the meeting began, it was clear the residents weren't holding back. One after another, they stood to share their stories of being unfairly targeted, mistreated, or ignored by law enforcement. Jake listened intently, his heart sinking with every testimony. It was a mirror held up to his own actions, reflecting the bias and injustice he had perpetuated, knowingly or not. A woman named Mrs. Carter stood to speak. She was in her 60s, her voice steady but laced with pain. My grandson was pulled over last month, she said. No reason, just driving home from work. The officer told him his taillight was out, but it wasn't. He was scared to death, thinking he might not make it home. Why does this keep happening? Her words hit Jake like a blow. He could feel the room's collective gaze burning into him, waiting for him to respond. Slowly, he stood, his voice heavy with remorse. I don't have an excuse, he began. What I can say is that I'm here to learn and to do better. I can't change the past, but I'm committed to changing how I move forward. The room remained silent for a moment before Marcus spoke up. Words are easy, Jake. Actions are harder. So, what's your plan? Jake nodded, grateful for the push. I've started reviewing the department's training protocols, especially around bias and community relations. It's clear we need to change how we're taught to see the people we serve. But I can't do it alone. I need your input, your stories, your ideas. I need your trust, even if I have to earn it one step at a time." There was a murmur of surprise and cautious approval. Jake knew it wasn't enough to win them over, but it was a start. After the meeting, Marcus approached him. "That was a good first step," he said. "But don't think for a second that one meeting will fix everything. You've got a lot of work to do, Jake." "I know," Jake replied, "and I'm ready for it." Over the next few months, Jake immersed himself in the community. He partnered with Marcus to organize workshops that brought residents and officers together to discuss their concerns. He worked to implement bias training at the precinct, pushing for transparency and accountability within the department. But change wasn't easy. Resistance came from both sides. Some officers mocked Jake, calling him a traitor for siding with the community. On the other hand, some residents were still hesitant to trust him, their skepticism rooted in years of mistreatment. One night, after a particularly heated workshop, Marcus found Jake sitting on the steps of the church, his shoulders slumped. "Tough crowd, huh?" Marcus said, sitting beside him. Jake let out a dry laugh. "You could say that. I don't blame them, though. I've got a lot to prove." Marcus nodded. "True, but you're proving it. You're showing up, and that counts for something." Jake looked at Marcus, gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks for not giving up on me." Marcus smiled faintly. "You've got a long way to go, Jake, but at least now you're on the right path." Jake felt a flicker of hope. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was making a difference. Not just as a cop, but as a person. The months that followed became a true test of Jake's commitment. Every day brought new challenges, both inside the precinct and out in the community. The officers who had once been his friends now viewed him with suspicion, some outright hostility. Words like traitor and soft were whispered behind his back. The community, while cautiously warming to his efforts, remained guarded. Jake understood why. Trust was not given, it was earned through consistency and action. One particularly cold morning, Jake sat at his desk reviewing a proposal for the precinct's first community liaison program. The goal was simple: to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the residents they served. But the pushback from his colleagues was fierce. Officer Murphy, an old-school cop with a gruff demeanor, stormed into Jake's office. "This is a waste of resources," Murphy barked, slamming the proposal onto Jake's desk. "You really think this is going to change anything?"
Jake met Murphy's glare calmly.
"It's not about changing everything overnight. It's about starting somewhere. People don't trust us, Murphy. And frankly, we've given them plenty of reasons not to." Murphy scoffed. "We do our jobs, Monroe. If they don't like it, that's their problem." Jake stood, his voice firm but measured. "It's not just about doing our jobs. It's about how we do them. You don't have to agree with me, but this is happening. End of discussion." Murphy stormed out, muttering under his breath, but Jake remained undeterred. He knew change wouldn't come without resistance, and he was prepared to face it head-on. Meanwhile, his relationship with Marcus grew stronger. The two spent hours brainstorming initiatives that could help heal the fractures between law enforcement and the community. Marcus's landscaping business had become a hub for open dialogue, a place where residents could voice their concerns without fear of judgment. One evening, as they locked up the shop, Marcus turned to Jake. "You know, when we were kids, I always thought you'd end up a teacher or something. Never figured you'd become a cop." Jake chuckled. "Yeah, well, I didn't either. I thought it would be a way to make a difference. Guess I didn't realize how much I had to learn first." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "You're learning now. That counts for something." Their conversation was interrupted by the buzz of Jake's phone. He frowned as he read the text. "There's been a shooting," he said grimly. "A teenager. Unarmed." Marcus's expression darkened. "Where?" Jake's stomach sank as he read the location. "Corner of Elm and Jefferson. Right in the heart of the neighborhood." The next few days were a blur of protests, press conferences, and mounting tension. The teenager, 17-year-old Devin Carter, had been shot by an officer during what should have been a routine stop. The officer claimed Devin had reached for something in his pocket, but witnesses said otherwise. Jake knew this was the moment everything hinged on. The community was demanding justice, and rightly so. Jake worked tirelessly to push for transparency in the investigation, even when it put him at odds with his own department. During a town hall meeting, the atmosphere was electric with anger and grief. Jake stood before the crowd, his heart pounding. "I can't undo what happened to Devin," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling around him. "But I promise you this, we will find the truth, and we will hold those responsible accountable. No more cover-ups. No more excuses." His words were met with a mix of applause and skepticism. Marcus, standing in the back of the room, gave Jake a nod of approval. As the investigation unfolded, Jake found himself spending long nights poring over evidence and testimonies. He pushed for an independent review board, knowing it was the only way to ensure a fair and unbiased investigation. The pressure mounted from all sides. His superiors warned him to tread carefully, while community leaders urged him to keep pushing. Through it all, Marcus remained his sounding board, offering guidance and encouragement when Jake felt like giving up. "You've got to see this through," Marcus told him one night. "This isn't just about Devin. It's about every kid who's ever been stopped for no reason. Every family that's lost someone to a system that doesn't care about them." Jake nodded, his resolve firm. "I won't stop, Marcus. Not until we get justice." But justice wouldn't come easily. The truth was buried under layers of bureaucracy and conflicting narratives. And as Jake prepared to face the most difficult decision of his career, he knew the next step would either make or break everything he had worked for. As the investigation into Devin Carter's death neared its conclusion, Jake found himself standing at the crossroads of his career and conscience. The evidence was damning. Body camera footage, suppressed by the department until Jake fought to release it, showed Devin raising his hands in surrender before being shot. The officer's claim that Devin had been reaching for a weapon was a blatant lie. Jake sat in his car outside the precinct, the weight of the decision before him pressing down like an iron vice. If he went public with the evidence, he risked alienating the department entirely, potentially ending his career. But if he stayed silent, he'd be complicit in a system that had failed Devin and so many others. With trembling hands, Jake made the call to the press. He provided the footage, along with a statement demanding accountability from his department. Within hours, the story was everywhere. The headlines painted Jake as both a hero and a traitor, depending on who was reading. The fallout was immediate. Protesters flooded the streets, their chants for justice echoing through the city. The officer who had shot Devin was arrested and charged, a small but significant step toward accountability. But for Jake, the consequences were far-reaching. His colleagues turned their backs on him, his locker vandalized with slurs and threats. His superiors placed him on administrative leave, citing conduct unbecoming. Jake knew this was their way of punishing him for exposing the truth. Marcus visited him that evening, finding Jake sitting on his porch, staring into the distance. "Rough day?" Marcus asked, handing him a cold beer. Jake let out a bitter laugh. "That's one way to put it. Feels like I've lost everything." Marcus shook his head. "Not everything. You've got your integrity. You've got people who believe in what you're doing. And you've got the chance to make real change." Jake sighed. "It doesn't feel like enough." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady. "It is enough, Jake, because you did what no one else would. You stood up. You fought for what was right. And because of you, Devin's family might finally see justice." Weeks later, Jake stood in the same church basement where his journey of redemption had begun. This time, the room was filled with a mix of community members, activists, and even a few officers. Jake, now officially no longer a part of the force, had been asked to speak about his experiences and the changes he hoped to see in the future. "I made mistakes," Jake began. his voice strong despite the nervous flutter in his chest. I let my biases and the system's flaws blind me to the truth. But I've learned that change doesn't come from staying silent. It comes from speaking up, even when it costs you everything. The crowd erupted in applause, Marcus leading the charge. Jake felt a swell of emotion, realizing that while he had lost his badge, he had gained something far more valuable: the trust and respect of the people he had once failed. As he stepped down from the podium, Marcus clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Jake." Jake smiled faintly, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. This is just the beginning. And it was. Jake's journey was far from over, but he was no longer the man who had turned a blind eye to injustice. He was a man who had faced his own failings, fought to make amends, and found his purpose in standing up for what was right, no matter the cost.